Hey, hi everyone. Welcome to this week's Information Study 752 Outreach Lecture, Introduction to Researcher Services. So here are weekly topics for this week. What do researcher services and archives entail? How are researcher services related to other archival practices? What tools do archivists use when responding to reference requests? What are the barriers to archivists answering reference requests? And what are the different types of reference knowledge that archivists should possess? So this is the first part of a multi-week exploration that we will look into the interface between archives and the public, specifically focusing on researcher services. So again, it's not a class or a series of lectures per se that are going to talk about how to answer a reference request and some of those other things. It's going to take kind of a more broader perspective on how researcher services relate to broader discussions surrounding outreach and advocacy, which is, of course, more relevant to this course. So we'll talk about how researcher services as a whole can be better reflective of the value and contributions that archives provide. Again, not necessarily here's what a reference request is and how to answer it, but kind of taking the broader perspective on researcher services. Okay, so we will talk about what do researcher services and archives entail. Again, speaking pretty broadly here. And these are related to some of the different types of archival reference knowledge that we will discuss somewhat briefly towards the end of this lecture. So researcher services and archives entail providing things like information about the repository, about holdings, information from holdings, certainly information about records creators and donors. Oftentimes that's something that researchers are interested in. Typically archives will maintain donor correspondence, and that can be a useful research tool for archives to or for researchers to look at and hopefully get some contextual knowledge about the records that they're looking at. Information about other repositories. If there are other repositories out there, then archivists can and certainly should refer researchers to those repositories if they may be valuable resources for meeting the researcher's information need. Researcher services can also touch on information about laws and ethics related to using records. So talking about copyright and privacy. Education about the research process. So helping researchers actually carry out their research, whether it be from a distance or in the reading room. And overall access to holdings. And a lot of this access, especially today, takes place through online collections, and that's certainly a part of reference staff's experiences working with researchers is helping them navigate through online resources to find the information that they're looking for. So you can certainly tie things like online collections and online finding aids and other uh, digital resources that researchers may work with as being a part of researcher services as well. So as Pete notes, essentially researcher services is, the act of facilitating research, undertaking research, and educating researchers, again, by providing the different types of information that I described and some of the different types of archival reference knowledge that the Duff, Gagel, and Thibault article, which you're probably already familiar with from 650, suggest that archives be able to provide. Okay, so next we will talk about a couple of different philosophies or I guess end goals that can be associated with researcher services. So this is from the one of the Pew excerpts that we looked at for this week, where the author contrasts differences between research services, which are more user-oriented, and reference services, which are more custodially oriented. And the overall differences between these two different philosophies, or I guess we can call them orientations, really go back to this idea of the purpose of the archive, and is the archive interested in actively making information contained within the archive easier for researchers to use and uh, to solve their information need with? Is it an archive that's really geared towards public service and public interaction? Or is it an archive that is more focused on other aspects of the archival process, and promoting use is kind of a secondary part of archiving to other archival practices and processes like appraisal, arrangement, description, preservation. So essentially, in one orientation, the research services orientation, reference is seen in a lot of ways as being one of, if not the most important processes that an archive carries out. And in a more custodial oriented uh, mindset or mission or plan or whatever you want to call it, reference and access is kind of uh, put at the kids' table and maybe sort of begrudgingly accepted and acknowledged by the archive. And we'll talk about the connection between archives and advocacy and archives and outreach in just a little bit, but you can pretty obviously see that one of these orientations is going to result in an archive being painted in a better light, right? If you are an archive that sees marketing as a priority, that sees promoting use and researcher services as priorities, uh, that believes that services should be geared towards users' needs, that focuses on the systematic gathering and analysis of user information to improve services, that's going to create a situation in which an archive is better able to serve the public, serve uh, interior and exterior audiences, and in turn present itself in a better light. Whereas if reference is seen as kind of a begrudgingly accepted part of archiving, and the needs and wishes of the public and of researchers isn't really considered to be an important thing, then that's really going to hinder the ability of that archive to respond effectively and efficiently to researcher queries, right? And that can be something that can obviously paint the archive in a pretty negative light. If you are a researcher and you try and research at an archive, and it's difficult for you to find out that the archive unit exists because they don't really do a lot of outreach and marketing isn't priority. And B, the tools that you have to use in order to find the information that you're looking for are subpar because there haven't been any researcher studies done to show what researchers actually want and need. So the online collections are a mess, and neither you nor the, maybe part-time reference archivist that you're working with can actually find what you're looking for. So, just overall, it's going to result in a pretty grim picture of public access, um, being one that is presented to the public. And, as we'll talk about in just a minute, that can reflect pretty poorly on a researcher's overall comprehension of an archive and of its value to the public. Okay, so next we'll talk about some of the connections between researcher services and other archival practices. So, all different arms of the same octopus, right? Um, you know, Octopi are probably my favorite animals. Did you know that an octopus has a brain for each arm that controls each arm, and then there's one main brain in the head? I mean, that's just fascinating. So they can operate kind of independently, or they can be coordinated by sort of the main brain in the head. I mean, that's just fascinating, and how they can blend in to their environment, and just such fascinating creatures. I really appreciate the octopus for sure. Um, but an octopus needs all of its arms in order to really thrive and be successful, and all of its arms are sort of coordinated and working towards the same goal. And in a lot of ways, the different services that an archive provides, it's the same thing. And you can definitely see some connections between them, which is what the Oestreicher chapter that we looked at for this week discusses. So, talking about how appraisal dictates materials available for reference, but also the data collected during reference can inform appraisal choices made. So, definitely some coordination there. When the author talks about processing, they describe how the quality of processing can influence the ease of researcher services. So if you have collections that are processed really well and are super easy to use, that's great for you as an archivist. That's great for the researcher. Everyone wins. But the author also mentions that reference data can inform processing decisions. So if you are a reference archivist and you see a lot of interest in a particular collection, and perhaps that collection isn't described terribly well, you can say, hey, processing archivist, maybe you can take another look at this collection and process it a little bit more deeply, or maybe use some different subject headings that are more appropriate, or whatever adjustments need to be made in order to better meet the needs of the researchers. Some interesting connections between reference and preservation. So the author talks about how reference services can cause preservation issues, right? People are in the reading room with their germy, oily hands, touching the records and, stuffing the records back into folders in a way that might be a little alarming. Um, and that can cause wear and tear of the records over time, right? It's kind of inevitable. Um, but reference can actually impact preservation positively if reference staff and researchers as well use it as an opportunity to identify potential preservation risks that they see. So if you see a paper that's maybe starting to tear a little bit, or you see some photographs that look like they're warping or discoloring, or whatever issues you see going on, you can say, hey, there's this issue going on, and do we need to address it? And if so, how can we address it? And also just by preventing people from stuffing records into folders with their oily, dirty hands. That can be another thing that reference staff can do to support preservation as well. So, some more connections between reference and other archival processes. All right, so I touched on online access and digital records, which is something that the Oestreicher chapter mentions. So, to elaborate on how I included online collections and online tools as a part of researcher services. Oestreicher just talks about how online access requires reference staff to communicate with researchers and how to use online resources. Here's how you look through our online collections. Here's how you want to look through your finding aid. That's definitely a part of the support that reference staff can provide. Uh, and Ostreicher also talks about how reference staff can monitor interactions with online systems and requests in order to suggest changes or improvement. So if they see that researchers are struggling with finding a particular service or using a particular service, or perhaps they themselves, when they're helping researchers, are struggling to navigate through a system, you know, reference staff can say, hey, this isn't very intuitive. Is there some way that we can work with IT or with a vendor or whomever to address this issue and make it a little bit easier for everyone to find the information that they're looking for. All right, and then Ostreicher also touches on the connection between researcher services and outreach and advocacy, which is something that I just touched on, but as Ostreicher mentions, reference interactions can shape how people view the archives. If you have a good interaction, if you're able to find what you're looking for efficiently, if the reference archivist is knowledgeable and doesn't seem just overwhelmed with the sheer amount of work that they have to do, then that can paint a pretty good picture of the archive overall, the competence of the archive, and the value that the archive provides. And of course, the opposite is true as well. So certainly, the better an archive is able to accomplish the task of helping a researcher find the information that they're looking for, generally speaking, the more positively that researcher is going to view the archive, and the more likelihood exists for that researcher to become an advocate for the archive, perhaps connect the archive with other people who may become advocates in the future. And it can be a real rising tide for repositories. And so a common denominator between a lot of these connections that I see is they're based on documenting researcher experiences and interactions, which can lead to a more user-oriented researcher services experience. So, a lot of the information that reference staff collect can lead to archives making more informed decisions about what collections to acquire, which collections to describe to a greater or lesser degree. How online collections and online findings are being used and if they're effective or not. So, it just depends on archives collecting that information in a systematic and useful way and actually making use of it. And if they do, then that can lead to the more user-oriented orientation for archives that I talked about before, and can lead to archives enjoying the benefits of having that philosophy and that mindset. Sip of water there. Okay, we're back. Okay, so next we'll talk about some of the tools that archivists use when responding to reference requests. This is something that the Peterson article touches on a fair amount. So things like archive management systems, which can, from my experience working at the American Heritage Center, we went from one that was sort of built in-house and was fairly antiquated to one that was provided by a vendor and was a lot more sophisticated and, just was more intuitive and easier to use and more comprehensive, and it was a big improvement. So the quality of archive management systems alone can really help archives accomplish the tasks that they need to accomplish. Archival experience and expertise is certainly one, and those are also a couple of the types of infrastructure that we've touched on, and we'll talk about those in just a minute. The Hawk article from this week mentions LibGuides, so collection guides that are related to a particular subject area. Those can certainly be powerful tools for researchers and reference archivists to be able to have a greater understanding of the content and context of particular collections. Things like tutorials and training are some other things that the Hawk article mentions. So having tutorials that explain to researchers, here's how you do research, here's how you work with their online collections, and of course, training for staff. And so as the Peterson article notes, as I just touched on, the quality of the tools available to archivists depends on their infrastructure. So for databases, for finding aids, underdeveloped archive management systems, they can obviously make an archivist's job more difficult. If it's a situation where archivists have to kind of use multiple tools to do what they need to do, that can be more time consuming. It can take more time to figure out what these different tools are and how to use them. So that can be less than desirable. But essentially, the better tools an archivist has to work with when responding to reference requests, the greater efficiency that they will have when meeting researcher needs. And that can detract from the sense of being overworked and overwhelmed, which the Hawk article touches on and which we will expand upon a little bit in just a minute. The Hawk article describes the most important tool as the knowledge of researchers and their intended use of materials. So things like user studies, which we'll touch on in just a little bit. But again, just having this understanding of how your researchers move through your online collections and other systems and tools that you provide that are public facing can help you evaluate sort of how well things are working or not working, and can allow you to tweak things to improve them and make the researcher experience better overall. But again, it just goes back to archives, bothering to collect that information and to use it to improve the different tools and portals and other things that they use to carry out researcher services. So again, we go back to this idea of infrastructure. Are you an archive that has, a lot of tools available to them to carry out researcher services, or you just have a rock, and it might be a cute rock with googly eyes, but it's still a rock, so a pretty kind of blunt tool, pretty outdated, that you're kind of expected to use to accomplish a lot of tasks, which it might not necessarily be very good at accomplishing. So, are you able to work with precision and work with efficiency and have resources that are geared towards solving specific problems, or are you maybe trying to kind of bash a square peg into a round hole? And of course, it all goes back to this idea of infrastructure. So, do you have relationships with other individuals and organizations that can help you get the tools you need to succeed? Do you have a placement within your archive, or does your archive have a placement within an organization that that leads you to be valued as an institution and supported as an institution? Do you have the freedom to say, well, we think that these tools will work better for what we're trying to do, and we would like you to provide them to us? Do you have staff that are able to use tools in the best way to meet researcher needs? So I'm sure I was going to come back to the idea of infrastructure at some point, and here it is. Okay, so next we'll talk about some of the barriers to archivists answering reference requests. I just touched on poor tools, tools that aren't really being used for what they were meant to be used or just are overall pretty ineffectual. But a huge barrier that the Hawk article touched on is a lack of staffing and a lack of archivists available to answer a reference request, to use their archival knowledge and expertise to sit at the reference desk and answer queries for researchers that come into the reference desk, or to respond to reference requests that come in through email or other vectors. So the Hawk survey indicated that 95% of responding archives indicated problems with staff levels, training, scheduling, and workload. So, obviously a an overwhelming majority of respondents. I think the author said that 5% of respondents said that there was nothing about their researcher services that was going well, which is, I mean, it sounds, pretty awful, right? To be in an archive where you feel like your connections with the public are just have been completely degraded. Um, so, staffing and having people available to respond to reference requests in an efficient and appropriate time, that can be a big issue. And perhaps some of you are experiencing that when you are getting responses back for your reference interview analysis papers, right? If it's taking archives weeks and weeks to get back to you, and maybe you got only a very like perfunctory answer and no real meaningful engagement, which from past experience, uh, grading these papers is probably what a lot of you are going through. That may well be due to poor staffing. Archivists just don't have the time to provide the deep level of interaction that might be appropriate in a lot of cases. They're sort of drinking out of a fire hose, right? Um, and obviously, this can be pretty problematic, uh, especially for archives with smaller staffs. If you're an archive and you only have 4 or 5 staff members and you're expected to have the reference desk open for X amount of hours per day, then you may struggle to do that, and that may take from other responsibilities that you have. It may take from away from some of the training, which can be an important tool for archivists to be exposed to. And poor staffing, as the Hawk article notes, can result in researchers being turned away from the archive. So imagine you have a research need and you go to the archive and they're like, oh, sorry, we just don't have anyone available to help you right now. Or you try and make an appointment with an archive and they say, okay, well, you can come into the reading room in about a month and hopefully we'll be able to help you. That just doesn't paint a good picture of an archive and the value of an archive that's very positive at all. And as the Hawk article notes, it can result in archives being unable to meet their mission of serving the public. So essentially, the public archive connection, which can be so valuable to helping people have a positive perspective on archives, is falling apart, and it either doesn't exist or it can be pretty degraded. And so obviously that's going to result in people not valuing archives at all, or as much as they would if they were actually able to use the reading room or work with a reference archivist in a uh, appropriate and efficient way. One interesting thing that the Hawk article mentioned is that there seemed to be a disconnect on the impact of staff shortages by supervisors or administrators overseeing archives. So I think there was an example where the archives couldn't meet its staffing obligations. They couldn't keep the reference desk staffed, and so they wanted to hire another staff member, and their supervisor said, Well, the only way that you can hire another staff member is if you extend the hours that you're open. So a lot of disconnect between the reality the reference staff are facing and people who, may or may not be a part of kind of the day-to-day actions of the archive and what their perception or understanding of what things are like is. Um, and I think that this might be a result of poor advocacy. It may be that archives uh, aren't demonstrating their value to the point where supervisors and administrators view them as being priorities, view researcher services as being a priority, and so they don't feel like researcher services is something that they really want or need to provide further support for. So there can be a real disconnect if people who are in positions of authority over the archives or can influence the infrastructure that archives have to survive just don't really understand sort of the day-to-day experiences of reference staff, and they don't understand or they don't care that because of staffing levels or other infrastructure issues, archives aren't able to meet expectations when it comes to helping the public. And so again, that's why advocacy and outreach is so important. Another thing that the Hawk article mentioned was resentment from non-reference staff to having to work on the reference desk or cover reference shifts. And again, this can go back to a mindset of not valuing reference, not valuing research or services, is seeing it as secondary to other processes that archives carry out. Like, oh, well, I'm a processing archivist and I don't really think that reference work is important, so I'm going to be upset if I have to sit on the reference desk. I see it as kind of like a um, a punishment, and it's distracting me from what I really need to get done. That's again, it's not a really great mindset if you want to have an archive that is responsive to the public and seeks to create a situation in which researchers can have their information needs met in a reasonable amount of time. Um, yeah, when I was at the HC, I always enjoyed working on the reference text. Sometimes it was a little stressful, uh, but you know, how often in your life do you get the opportunity to actually help someone, right? And people can come into archives for some pretty serious reasons, like dissertation, family research, you know, they're writing a book, and if you can help those people, then that can be a really positive thing. And yeah, I just don't know why you would see having the opportunity to do that as being some kind of punishment. But if you're in an archive that doesn't value sort of connecting with the public, then that might be the mindset that takes hold. And again, it's not going to be a mindset that is going to help your archive be successful in the long run. So again, we can connect this idea of barriers to answering reference requests back to this idea of research. Having leadership that don't value researcher services, not having the staff to work the reference desk or to answer reference emails in a timely manner. Not having the facilities where if people are working at the reference desk, they can work on other things that they might be involved with when maybe there's less action in the read room, which is something that the Hawk article touched on. And we can again tie that back to placement of the archives within the organization. If your archives is seen as being important, then maybe you're more likely to get the staff that you need in order to carry out your research or services in a more um, sufficient manner. So yeah, at the end of the day, infrastructure is finite and resources are finite. And if researcher services is viewed as kind of a secondary aspect of archiving, then it may be difficult to come across some of these resources and connect them to researcher services. And again, that can result in a lot of negative repercussions for archives. Okay, so we'll wrap things up by talking about these different types of archival reference knowledge. Again, I won't go through them one by one since that's what the article does. You will be working with these for your reference interview analysis assignments. So I definitely encourage you to review them since I know that we read this in 650. But it's possible to look at these through a little bit of a different perspective. So what I see when I look at these different types of archival reference knowledge is that they can each be supported by other aspects of archival administration that reference both takes from and gives to. So when you look at knowledge of holdings and contextual knowledge of holdings, if arrangement and description is done in a more thorough and adequate manner, then it's going to be easier for reference archivists to understand what is in the archive and how different materials in the archive are related to each other. If you want to look at access systems, these can be influenced by the experiences of reference staff, and ideally they should be. So the kind of situation in which reference archivist has users of the access systems are able to provide their feedback about access systems and suggest ways in which they could be improved. Looking at domain knowledge, if you are an archive that is conducting appraisal really well, then you should have appraisal notes and other information that you gain during appraisal, and that can provide a resource for archivists to have a greater understanding of kind of the bigger picture behind the records that they are working with, and pass that information along to researchers the reference staff are working with. And it's important to note that training is a great way for these different skills to be developed. And if reference staff are, too busy doing other things or, working on the desk to have training in, research or artifactual knowledge or domain knowledge, then that can detract from their ability to share these different types of archival reference knowledge with researchers. Another big one is experience, right? So just answering reference requests, getting more familiar with the archives, holding, getting more experience working with people, which can maybe be one of the more difficult parts of researcher services and working on the reference desk. But certainly you can connect experience and expertise to staff infrastructure and make a connection between these types of archival reference knowledge and infrastructure in that way. And to connect back with the idea of researcher services as being a primary way for archives to demonstrate their value, a lot of that demonstration of value can come from these different types of archival reference knowledge. So if you're able to draw upon your domain knowledge to help a researcher understand the context of what they're looking at, the historical context. If you're able to use your artifactual knowledge to help a researcher understand, what kind of paper a record is printed on and what that says about the record. If you're able to use your knowledge of holdings and contextual knowledge of holdings to help a researcher think of relevant materials that they hadn't thought of before. If you're able to use your knowledge of access systems to help a researcher navigate through your online collections and your online findings. that's where archives can really shine and can really demonstrate that archives are professionals, that they have unique bodies of knowledge and that they're able to share these unique bodies of knowledge with other people and use these unique bodies of knowledge to help people out. And that can be such a powerful message and a powerful thing to do. Okay, so we'll go ahead and wrap up there. Again, this was an introduction to some additional topics that we'll talk about over the next few weeks. And this is our second module of this course. So looking more at things like information seeking behavior, user studies, and how they can support an archive's ability to develop researcher services and continue researcher services that provide a better experience for researchers and serve as more effective communicators of an archive's value to both the general public and to stakeholders as well. So to be continued for a lot of this stuff. But as always, thank you for listening and let me know if you have any questions.